For 14 months, John Thune had the same answer whenever the Save America Act came up. Not yet. Not when reporters pressed him. Not when senators pushed behind closed doors. Not when the president applied pressure. Not when the House escalated. Not when conservatives demanded a vote. The argument stayed the same. The votes were not there, and there was no path through the Senate. At 11:47 this morning, that answer changed. What forced the change was not a new poll, a new deal, or a sudden shift in the vote count. It was Mike Lee walking onto the Senate floor and using a procedural move leadership could no longer ignore. Lee did not hold a press conference. He did not post on X. He did not give a long speech demanding action. He filed a motion to proceed to the Save America Act. That sounds technical. It was anything but. A motion to proceed forces the Senate to confront a basic question: will the chamber even take up the legislation? The motion can be debated. It can be amended. It can be filibustered. But once Lee filed it, Thune could no longer leave the bill sitting off stage and answer every demand with the same 2 words. He now had a choice. Thune could schedule the vote himself, on leadership's timeline and under leadership's control. Or he could allow Lee's motion to move forward on Lee's terms and let the confrontation unfold on the Senate floor. What he could no longer do was act as if the question had not been put in front of the chamber. By 11:47 a.m., Thune made his decision. He called the vote. For the first time in 14 months, the Save America Act was no longer trapped in a fight over whether the Senate would take it up. The fight was moving onto the floor. The stall was over. The fight was not, and that distinction matters. A bill sitting in a drawer can disappear without forcing every senator to answer for it. A bill on the floor lives or dies in public, with votes attached to names. That does not mean the bill is passing. It does not mean the 6-0 vote barrier has disappeared. And it does not mean the procedural fight is over. What changed is where the fight now has to happen. Until this morning, senators could argue over strategy while the bill remained outside the chamber. Leadership could point to the vote math, the filibuster, and the lack of a clear path forward. Now senators are moving toward an actual floor confrontation where positions have to be recorded. To understand why that matters, start with what the bill would do and then look at the numbers that have defined this fight. The Save America Act would require proof of United States citizenship to register for federal elections and valid photo identification to cast a ballot. The House passed the Save America Act 3 times. The Senate has voted on it 6 times without clearing the 6-0 vote filibuster threshold. Then, on June 5, 50 senators went on the record supporting the legislation during an all-night amendment session. Vice President Vance's tie-breaking vote would have made it 51. That established the central problem. 51 may be enough for a majority. Under the existing filibuster rules, it is not enough to get past 60. Since June, the pressure on Thune has only intensified. Trump threatened to veto government funding legislation unless the SAVE Act was attached. The parliamentarian rejected the grant-based reconciliation workaround Thune had been treating as an alternative. A federal judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking key provisions while a constitutional challenge moved forward. Conservatives identified 15 Republican holdouts and began focusing pressure on individual names. Then one senator moved away from that group and toward the talking filibuster position. Speaker Johnson escalated again, freezing the House floor and declaring that no legislation would receive a vote until the Senate acted. The pressure kept widening. Court action, House action, White House pressure, conservative pressure, and a growing procedural argument inside the Republican conference. 7 separate escalations had piled up in 10 weeks, yet none had moved Thune off his position. Pressure after pressure, escalation after escalation. And still, Thune's answer remained the same. The votes were not there. The path did not exist. This morning, Mike Lee stopped asking Thune to find that path. He created one. And the power of that move was not simply that it put another vote on the calendar. It changed the political cost of doing nothing. A motion to proceed can itself be filibustered. In theory, 41 senators can block the Senate from even moving into debate on the bill. But that creates a different kind of record. Instead of merely voting against the Save America Act, opponents could be recorded blocking the Senate from even taking up the legislation. Not blocking final passage, blocking the chamber from reaching the debate itself. 4 weeks before November, that distinction matters politically. The footage Lee's move could produce was not simply a failed bill. It was senators on camera and on the official record stopping the Senate from even having the debate. That was the pressure built into Lee's move. The confrontation would no longer be buried inside leadership negotiations or procedural delay. It would happen on the floor, on camera, on the official record, with November approaching. Either the Senate moves toward debate on the bill, or opponents are forced to show that they are stopping the chamber from getting there. Either outcome makes the fight visible. That is why Thune's real choice was narrower than it first appeared. He could let Lee's motion dictate the confrontation, or he could take control of the timing and structure himself. He chose control, and by scheduling the vote, Thune gave up one part of the argument that had defined this fight. The Senate could in fact be brought to the point of taking up the bill. The harder question is whether getting there can produce passage. That distinction matters because Senate leaders have brought legislation to the floor before without knowing they had the votes to win. In 2017, Mitch McConnell faced that problem during the effort to repeal Obamacare through reconciliation. The votes were uncertain. Pressure from the president and the House was intense. McConnell brought the legislation to the floor anyway, betting that a live vote might produce movement that closed-door negotiations had not. It did produce movement, but not the result supporters wanted. John McCain's thumbs down helped sink the bill by one vote in the middle of the night. That is the warning built into what happened this morning. Thune scheduling the Save America Act does not mean Thune knows he can pass it. It means refusing to schedule it had become more damaging than accepting the uncertainty of a floor vote. And even now, the first battle is not necessarily final passage. The next 72 hours matter because the sequence matters. The first question is whether the Senate opens the door to debate at all. It is the gateway. The Senate has to decide whether to proceed to the bill and open debate. Under the standard rules described in this fight, ending debate on that motion requires 60 votes. If Thune brings the bill forward without a plan to reach 60 and without changing the rules to make a simple majority enough, the motion can fail before final passage ever arrives. The bill would have reached the floor. Senators would have been forced onto the record. The confrontation Lee wanted would have happened, but the same wall would still be standing. That is why Thune's announcement matters for what it did not say. He said the Senate would take up the Save America Act. He did not publicly specify the exact procedural route. He did not say the bill would move as a standalone measure under the normal 6-0 vote cloture requirement. He did not say reconciliation would be used. He did not say the talking filibuster approach would be adopted. He announced the destination. He did not announce the rules of the road. And those rules now determine the real meaning of the vote. There are three paths described in this fight. The first is the standard cloture path. Bring the bill up under the normal process. Require 60 votes to end debate. Test whether that support exists. That path gives the bill its floor moment, gives senators recorded positions, and satisfies the demand for a vote. But unless the coalition reaches 60, it does not solve the problem that has existed from the beginning. The second path changes the equation. Thune could move toward the talking filibuster approach Mike Lee has been advocating. Under that structure, senators who want to block the bill would have to maintain an active presence on the floor. The political picture would change with it. Instead of the story being Republicans failing to find 60 votes, opponents would be seen maintaining the filibuster to stop the legislation from advancing. Once that opposition could no longer hold the floor, the bill could move with 51 votes. That is why this route matters to the coalition arguing that a majority for the bill already exists. The problem is not simply whether 50 or 51 senators support it. The problem is whether Senate procedure allows that majority to count. Changing the rule for this fight would require its own majority vote. The strategy described here says Thune could do that with 51 Republicans. That would expose a different question, not whether supporters can find 9 more votes to reach 60, but whether Republicans themselves are willing to change the process that has kept the bill from advancing. Then there is the third path, the reconciliation override. The parliamentarian had already rejected the grant-based reconciliation workaround. Under this approach, the vice president, acting from the chair, would overrule that ruling. 50 senators would then sustain the chair, allowing the legislation to move through reconciliation under a simple majority framework. It is the most aggressive option described here, and the one carrying the greatest institutional controversy. But strategically, it has one major difference from the gateway fight. It could produce a final passage vote. 3 paths, 3 different political outcomes. Standard cloture keeps the 6-0 vote wall in place. The talking filibuster route changes how opponents must maintain their blockade and could allow 51 to become enough. The reconciliation override tries to move around the parliamentarian's ruling and into a simple majority process. Thune has not publicly said which one he intends to use. That unanswered question now matters more than the calendar. The calendar tells you when the confrontation begins. The rules tell you whether the confrontation can change the outcome. There is a legitimate reason for supporters to see this morning as a breakthrough. For 14 months, the argument was over whether the Senate would act at all. Now it will. The fight is moving out of conference rooms and onto the Senate floor. Senators who could previously point to leadership's calendar will have to attach their names to actual decisions. Opponents will have to vote. Republican holdouts will have to vote. Every procedural move will become part of the public record. That is real movement. But it is not the same thing as victory. If Thune chooses the standard cloture route, reaches the floor, fails to clear 60, and treats that defeat as the end of the effort, the underlying obstacle has not changed. The bill will have received its floor moment. The pressure campaign will have forced action. The Senate will have produced the recorded confrontation. But the rule that blocked passage before will still be standing. That is the scenario critics of Thune fear most. A managed defeat. A vote that looks like escalation without changing the mechanism that determines the outcome. The bill would not die quietly in a drawer. It would die publicly. That may produce different optics, but it is not the same thing as using a procedural route designed to make a simple majority enough. So the central question has changed. Mike Lee forced the fight over whether the Senate would take up the bill. The next fight is over how. For months, supporters argued that 51 votes could be enough if the Senate used the right procedural tools. They were told the votes were not there. They were told the path did not exist. This morning, Lee filed the motion. Thune responded by scheduling the vote. For the first time in 14 months, the argument is no longer over whether the Senate will take up the Save America Act. It will. Now, the unresolved question is whether Thune chooses rules that leave the bill facing 60, or a procedural path that allows 51 to matter. One path could end with another floor defeat and allow leadership to say the vote happened. Another could turn 14 months of pressure into a simple majority fight. The vote schedule tells us the stall is over. The rules announcement will tell us what kind of fight has actually begun. And that is the question I want you to answer. Do you think Thune will actually use a path that allows 51 votes to matter, or is this heading toward a managed defeat under the same 6-0 vote rules? Tell me what you think in the comments, because the next procedural announcement may determine the entire outcome of this fight.